Marshall?
Yep.
Glenn Greenwald, welcome to the Realignment.
Thank you for having me, Tyler. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. All right, so it's funny, when I was booking you for this podcast, you were like, do you actually want the book? Like, is this going to be like a real book show? And I was like, yeah, I want to write about the book. And I think what's funny is that there are a lot of people who know you in a very specific context, either online or more. And one of the constant criticisms was like, Glenn Greenwald is a useful idiot of the right. Or like, probably 10 years ago, it was Glenn Greenwald is a useful idiot of the left. I'm like, well, if you actually read his book, or look at any of the work, Glenn Greenwald is both a real journalist and a left-wing journalist. That's one of the things that we wanted to get into with you in terms of why you decided to write this book, your own experience reporting on what was happening in Brazil under Bolsonaro's government, and more. And I'm curious, just from your perspective, whether it's refreshing to be able to talk, not just in an environment like this, but about something which is actually about your real work, because so many people apparently don't really know what you've actually done or do whenever it comes to your journalism.
Well, it's interesting because the Snowden story that I did in 2013 through 2014 and 2015, for which I had been best known at that point, was never really a story that broke down along clean ideological lines, which is one of the things I liked most about it. It appealed to a lot of leftists because of a long-standing distrust of the U.S. security state, which we were exposing. But it made a lot of liberals angry because the person who was president at the time was Barack Obama, who presided over and was responsible for a lot of the programs we were denouncing. And then on the right, you saw a similar division where there's a kind of long-standing dislike for security state whistleblowers, going back to Daniel Ellsberg and viewing him as a traitor rather than a whistleblower for leaking classified information to journalists, something that the right has long looked with kind of askance at. But at the same time, there's a deep ideological strain among the right that values the Fourth Amendment and the right to privacy as much as anything, the idea that the federal government should be kept out of our lives as much as possible. So the idea that the federal government was using this vast spying system to intervene in the lives of American citizens and monitor what we were saying and with whom we were speaking was something that appealed to a lot of people on the right as well. And it kind of confused the ideological breakdown. One of the things I liked most about it, and I viewed that as a crucial part of the journalism, like, is Snowden on the left or the right? Like, to this day, people can't really place him either. And the journalism I did in Brazil that this book is about, to me, is very similar, because even though it ended up just by happenstance exposing corruption on the part of multiple people who at the time we were doing the reporting happened to be very aligned with and important to the Bolsonaro government, particularly this one judge who had presided over the car wash anti-corruption probe and became a national hero. He had imprisoned a bunch of left-wing politicians like Lula da Silva at a time when polls showed that Lula would have beaten Bolsonaro in 2018. He imprisoned him. And then Bolsonaro turned around and selected this judge as his justice minister and made him a central part of his government. So when we started doing reporting that targeted this judge, the Bolsonaro government, it was very destabilizing to them. And at that point, the kind of following that this anti-corruption probe had generated for itself merged with the hardcore far-right Bolsonaristas because they were joined at the hip.
Right.
And I became the public enemy number one of the Bolsonaro government, in part also because my husband's a member of Congress with the actual left-wing socialist party that Bolsonaro hates most. But the reality is the reporting itself was not really ideological. It was about the failure on the part of the judiciary and prosecutors to abide by the rules when imprisoning people, failing to offer due process to criminal defendants for political ends, something that could easily end up implicating the rights of people on the right as well as anywhere on the spectrum. And ironically, in early 2020, that judge, or then justice minister, resigned from the Bolsonaro government. And on his way out, he denounced the government and Bolsonaro for being corrupt in his view. And he became public enemy number one of the Bolsonaro movement. He replaced me. And they began, Bolsonaristas did, citing my reporting as proof that their new enemy was in fact corrupt. So, even there, there's a lot of ideological confusion, but obviously the fact that I was confronting a far-right government, I think is very difficult to maintain this script that I'm now this kind of crypto, fascist or member of the alt-right.
Yeah.
I think what I want to do before we get into Brazil, because you make the very useful point in the book and also in the op-ed or the excerpt you had come out in The Nation today about how despite Brazil's prominence, despite the fact that it has a humongous population, despite the fact that it has like very deep energy reserves, it's not really in the conversation, especially in the Western Hemisphere. At the start of the book, you talk about how you had a conversation with Carl Bernstein, who is famous for obviously uncovering Watergate with Bob Woodward. And he told you specifically that the Snowden story, that reporting was probably going to be the biggest story you covered in your career. So now that you're following up on this specific area in a way that like very directly relates to your security, to your safety, to your husband's work, how would you place the story you're covering Brazil in the context of your work with Snowden and everything there at the Intercept?
It was interesting. That conversation I had with Carl Bernstein, it was in Sweden. We were there to do an event. The theme of it was kind of the journalist who broke the biggest story of the prior generation, which was Watergate, has a conversation about journalism with the journalist who broke the biggest story of this generation, which was the NSA Snowden story. And he and I had dinner the night before because we had exchanged a bunch of insults, as I'm prone to do in the media, about that work. And we just kind of wanted to clear the air. He invited me to dinner. And we left it off quickly. And then he said to me, he said, look, you may already realize this, but let me just tell you from experience, like when you get a story like this, it's a once in a lifetime story. You're never going to have another story like this ever again. So enjoy it while it lasts. And I actually found that out kind of traumatizing. Part of me at first when he said that, was kind of this defiance. Like internally, I was like, fuck you, Carl Bernstein, just because you never got another story like that.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean I'm going to be plagued by the same failure. And then every year that went by, I felt good about my journalism, but it was true. It was never on the same, kind of level or magnitude of the Snowden story. And I started wondering, like, wow, was Carl Bernstein right? Like, did I kind of peak at 44 or 45 or however old I was? And then I did end up getting the story. And almost from the beginning, I realized that it was going to be at least as significant as the Snowden story. Obviously, one difference is that the Snowden story impacted multiple nations around the world, almost every major country. It breached diplomatic relations between countries, whereas this story was about one country in particular. But in terms of the enduring impact that it had on changing the history of Brazil, as well as the intensity of the experience in reporting it and the kind of backlash I had to navigate and ultimately the impact it fostered, I think that on some level, it was even a wilder story than what happened with Snowden, and the journalism might even be more consequential when viewed from the long term.
Yeah, so let's just start and focus on Brazil then, because I love the part where the first chapter where you're just describing the history of Brazil, which once again I did not know. I don't think Sagar knew as well, really. So. Nope. You start off by giving a couple like really interesting facts about Brazil. So, for example, was one of the last like major countries to abolish slavery, and it has a very diverse population. Yet much of that wealth is concentrated in the white parts of the population, power, etc. Could you just describe Brazil for us as a country and like what drew you to it in the first place?
Yeah, so I began visiting there just kind of as a tourist in the mid 1990s, and I remember the first time I ever got to Rio de Janeiro. I said to the person with whom I was traveling at the time, I'm really worried that I'm never going to see any other part of the world again, because every time I have time to go to vacation, I'm going to want to come to Rio de Janeiro. It just like kind of spoke to my soul from the very first second I got there, that first day. And I did end up going back many, many times. And then in 2005, met my husband and have lived here since. So that's 16 years now. I think one of the things that fascinates me most about it is a singular country in terms of its culture, in terms of its history, in terms of the people. Size-wise, it's almost as large as the continental United States.
Yeah.
And it, population-wise, is just slightly smaller. It's the fifth most populous country in the world. It has a population of 230 million as opposed to 330 million in the US. So similar population size, a little bit smaller. So it's just massive. And there's, different regions like in the US with different cultures and different religions. But what, has always made Brazil so fascinating is the kind of phrase of Brazil Well, there's two phrases that I find so interesting, and they kind of go together. One is God is Brazilian, by which Brazilians mean, look at what he gave us. There's just no other country that has what we have, like in terms of natural beauty, natural resources, the beauty of the people. Like, obviously, God is Brazilian. But then the other phrase that kind of cuts against that is Brazil is always the country of the future. Like, you go back to the 30s, and you can find political analysts saying this is going to be the decade of Brazil because it's so full of potential, like brilliant, culturally powerful population, so many resources, natural resources, economic resources, and yet the legacy of slavery, it was actually the last country to eliminate slavery, and I think the last country period, but I think the category is, in the kind of hemisphere or whatever. It was 1888 when slavery was abolished. And just like the US and other countries, it has had enormous difficulty overcoming the legacy. So in Brazil, for example, whites are a minority of the population, not a tiny minority, like probably around 40%, and yet occupy almost every hall and place of power. But the bigger problem is the wealth and income inequality that makes the US look egalitarian. There's a tiny sliver of extremely rich oligarchs who wield all the power. There's virtually no middle class. And then the rest of the country lives in inconceivable poverty. And that has always been the tragedy of Brazil, but also at the same time, the thing that makes you realize that if that could be overcome, and during the Lula years in the kind of 2000s, millions of people were lifted out of poverty. A middle class started to form. Brazil grew fast economically. It became the sixth biggest economy in the world. It surpassed the UK. And you started seeing what could actually happen when these poor people who had never had a future were now able to go to college, buy homes, this emergence of middle class. And yet it all kind of unraveled once the 2008 financial crisis struck Brazil. The commodity prices collapsed, and it went back to political, economic, and security chaos, multiple crises that led to Bolsonaro. So that's, what makes Brazil so fascinating. And then the other part of it is the recent political history. We talk a lot about famous coups led by the CIA in places like Iran, which to this very day is responsible for the Iranians hating the United States, the fact that we overthrew their democratically elected government in 1954 and replaced him with this brutal tyrant, the Shah of Iran, who ruled until 1979 when there was an Islamic revolution, or at places like Indonesia and Guatemala, where we propped up horrible dictators. But Brazil was an example as well, where in 1964, they had this kind of center-left leader, and Brazil had been very steadfastly avoiding either the axis of Moscow or Washington during the Cold War. It was a center-left government, very mild, kind of like Scandinavia reforms, like rent control and some land reforms, nothing communist or anything. But that was too much for the Kennedy administration and then the Johnson administration, and they plotted with right-wing Brazilian generals to overthrow that government, provided arms to this right-wing faction of the military, overthrew the government within a day in 1964, and then a military regime proceeded to rule over Brazil for 21 years until 1985 with extreme brutality, murdering dissidents, imprisoning journalists, exiling artists, the whole panoply of Cold War dictatorship era stuff that the UK and the US supported, and that continues to hover over Brazil's politics as well.
Glenn, it's interesting. We have a lot of debates here about crime, violence, and all that. But one of the things you acknowledge, in your book is about the sheer amount of violence which is in Brazil, and you were just a victim yourself of a violent crime. I'm curious from your perspective how you view violence in the context of the Brazilian story, the root causes, etc. I mean, there's some efforts to say like it's all the U.S. fault, Cold War legacy, etc. I think it's probably more nuanced. I'm curious for your take on that in light of this most recent experience. Which, if you're comfortable or uncomfortable, whatever, please tell me. Just speaking about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's two kinds of crime plaguing Brazil. One is violent street crime, kind of common criminality. And then the other is political crime. And they're very different in terms of the impact that they have, but they're both at epidemic crisis levels in Brazil. So, for example, if you look at the murder rate in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, which is the largest city in the hemisphere, the likelihood that a police officer will be killed in the line of duty on any given day is higher than it was for any member of the US military at the height of the Iraq War. I think it's like 3,000 police officers in Rio de Janeiro were killed last year alone in the line of duty.
Last year? Wow.
Yeah, just I'm talking about
That's the Iraq War. That's almost
literally the Iraq
yeah,
War.
Wow.
Right. And so it's and then you have these like extremely well-armed drug trafficking gangs that have presided over the slums, because the slums are basically like squatter territory. So the law doesn't apply there. They're kind of illegal homes. They just kind of leave them to their own devices. And the only time the government ever takes an interest is when it goes in and has shootouts with drug gangs that often indiscriminately kill huge numbers of civilians. And just like the US War on Terror, every time the police go in and kill an innocent person, a worker on his way to work, or a young schoolgirl standing by a window, the people of that community are driven closer to the drug lords, and have greater levels of animosity towards the police, and see the police as their enemy and the drug lords as their protectors. And then so you have that kind of crime, and then you have just kind of like street crime as well, where people suffering with extreme poverty and extreme deprivation and no way out. It's routine for them to guns are everywhere, use firearms to rob people, to steal from people, to invade their homes. That's one kind of violence. The other kind is political violence, which is definitely still a residue from the military dictatorship. And now what you have are, in addition to these drug gangs, you have these militias that have become much more dangerous, these paramilitary gangs that began as kind of like vigilante squads. So they were groups of former police and military officers who said, we're going to patrol our white neighborhoods and, stand up to these thugs. And very quickly they turned into a much more menacing kind of lawlessness, this parallel government. They rule huge portions of major cities, including in Rio de Janeiro. And one of the scandals of the Bolsonaro government is that it turns out that the Bolsonaro family has very close ties to the most savage and the most brutal of those militias. For me, aside from the recent incident, which I'll talk about quickly in a minute, the kind of formative experience for us was in 2016. My husband ran for the city council of Rio de Janeiro, and he was elected. It was kind of a historic candidacy because he was the first openly gay person ever in the history of Rio de Janeiro to be elected. My husband comes from a favela. He grew up as an orphan. He wasn't part of this political establishment. And there was a woman elected along with him, very similar, but with a much bigger vote than he got, Marielle Franco, who had worked on investigating these militias for 10 years as part of the state legislature. And she got this enormous vote total. And she became this huge icon and figure, this Black woman who had a baby at 19, went back to college, got her master's in sociology. And she became our best friend. My husband and she sat next to each other in the city council. And on March 14th, 2018, when she was leaving an event at around 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night, she was in her car being driven back home by her driver. And two cars actually pulled up right behind her. One of the cars rolled down the window and shot 14 bullets into her car, 4 of which went into her skull, 3 of which went into the back of her driver, killing each of them instantly. And, that was very devastating politically because she was such a kind of symbol of hope for this population that never had any. But also personally, it was quite devastating because of how close we were to her and her wife. And so this was about a year before this source contacted me and I began doing this dangerous reporting. So that's the kind of thing that was hovering in the air at all times. And that kind of political assassination, like in the 60s with the US, where you had John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and George Wallace and a ton of, lesser figures being politically assassinated. Political violence becomes the currency. It's very hard to expel it. It just becomes one of the ways that people deal with political problems. And then, so I was, recently the victim of a fairly ordinary but pretty brutalizing home invasion. I was at a farm and 5 armed men entered. Fortunately, my first concern was that they were there not for mercenary reasons, but for a political attack. And it turned out they just wanted money. They stayed about an hour, threatened. I was there with an off-duty police officer, cracked his ribs, put a gun in my mouth, repeatedly threatened to shoot us, and then ended up tying us up when they were ready to leave. So yeah, violence for everybody is in the air in Brazil. And I think, when I try and explain why a country that has had a center-left government for the last 2 decades with the Workers' Party under Lula and Dilma suddenly turned to a figure like Bolsonaro, it isn't that the country just overnight embraced this kind of far-right, authoritarianism. It's that for very valid reasons, and we've seen this in many other countries, including in the US and the UK with President Trump,
right.
They just concluded that the ruling class was failing them, didn't care about them. And whoever postured as an outsider willing to go in and destroy that ruling class is somebody that they were willing to take a gamble on because the status quo was so unsustainable. So when he says, I'm going to unleash the police and kill all the criminals, I'm going to, restore morality, I'm going to end corruption, it's like a primal drive that he's tapping into. And he's a very talented demagogue. And people say, you know what, I don't like when he talks about gay people and indigenous people and Black people, but what I care about most is that when I send my children to school each day, I'm afraid they're not going to return back home. And when people have that level of fear and deprivation, they'll take gambles.
Something I'm really fascinated by here is like your articulation of the lost promise of Brazil, especially when it comes to the economic issues, because Sagar and I were in our late 20s, so we grew up when the discourse around Brazil was more positive, right? The whole BRICS idea. Yeah. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Some BRICS have done well, some BRICS haven't done well. But the key thing was Brazil is really supposed to be, like you said, that country of the future. So I'm curious, can you articulate what went wrong? Because one thing I want to pin on this too is, in your article in The Nation, you were talking about how, in many ways, the support for Bolsonaro was a rejection of neoliberalism, much in the same way that there was a rejection of the neoliberal establishment in Europe, in the United States. But what's interesting about Brazil specifically, though, is with Lula, with Dilma, these weren't like traditional Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, European Union bureaucrats who were rejected. These were people, like you said, Dilma was illiterate till he was 10. He was a factory worker. Lula was Dilma was a former Marxist guerrilla who was tortured by the military regime. So it was a little different. They were working for the Workers' Party. So given that, and the key thing too is that Workers' Party held power. So what specifically went wrong in Brazil economically? Because that doesn't seem to be the recipe for neoliberal 1990s policies. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, most of us who are politically heterodox in any way complain a lot about the fact that in the US, there's two-party rule, which leaves you with no options. And you end up in a party with, huge numbers of people who you have actually nothing in common with, whose ideology you despise, but the other one's just a little bit worse. And it seems like that's always your choice. Brazil has, I think now it has like 28 political parties. It often has like 32, 24. It's an incredibly chaotic system. Obviously, you get to pick and choose which party you want, but in order to form a governing coalition, you're making constant compromises because you need multiple parties in your coalition, including ones that are kind of centrist or even, on the right, or more ones that are like just transactional. So Lula is a fascinating figure. I think he's one of the most important political leaders of the late 20th century and into the early 21st century. He ran for president 3 times before winning, and he came close to winning each time, but couldn't, because the argument was international capital is going to flee. They depicted him as this kind of like Castro or Chavez figure, bringing communism to Brazil. He was a labor leader, super charismatic, wasn't educated. And the kind of bourgeois class was petrified of him, even while he was moving the poor to vote for him. And in 2002, he's like, I'm fucking tired of losing. Like, I'm not losing again. I've lost 3 times. So in 2002, he picked as his vice presidential running mate this kind of like business figure, this multi-millionaire who had extreme success in like textile industry and had the confidence of bankers and the business class as his vice president. And he entered into a ruling coalition with a lot of these centrist neoliberal parties. And so if you look at Lula's governance from 2002 to 2010, what you find is that, as I was saying earlier, he didn't just redistribute wealth. Brazil grew economically very rapidly. It had enormous amounts of economic growth, which obviously is driven by the growth of Brazilian businesses, which in turn needs a government greasing the wheels of those businesses, which he very much did. And even though there were a lot of anti-poverty programs that were instituted, including ones that got praised by like the World Bank and The Economist, one in particular that provides a monthly payment to single mothers as long as each month they show proof of vaccination and school attendance. So they're incentivized to keep their kids in, kind of a path of constructive society. Even though millions of people got pulled out of poverty, the rich did very, very well under Lula. So it wasn't a kind of socialist paradise at all. It was kind of the broad outlines of neoliberalism, which was, we're going to make sure the rich do really well, and we're going to just give some more crumbs to the poor. A lot of crumbs, but still, relatively speaking, crumbs. Income inequality was still vast. And that was all going great. Everybody was happy. The rich were doing better. The poor were doing better. He got terminated out of office in 2010. Yeah, with an 86% approval rating. Literally 86. Imagine somebody who's viewed as that kind of like a radical extremist menace. And then after 8 years running this country, the kind of person who never wields power in Brazil, he leads office with 86%. Probably like the only people who didn't like him were the pre-Bolsonaristas who just don't like democracy. And then what happened is his handpicked successor, who was Dilma Rousseff, the first woman president of Brazil in a country that's very patriarchal. I think Lula just kind of got off on the idea that he could was so powerful, he could even put an unknown, uncharismatic, technocratic woman. She was a Marxist guerrilla, but by that point, she becomes kind of technocrat. She worked under Lula's government. She was the economics minister. She was the chairman of the board of Petrobras, the huge Brazilian state oil company. And it all kind of came crashing down, in part because PT was very involved in the systemic corruption that had driven Brazil for a long time, which is fine as long as everyone's doing well. But as I said, the kind of after effects of the 2008 financial crisis in the US, 2 or 3 years after the fact, started devastating developing countries like Brazil, and commodity prices on which Brazilian economy relies, which drove a lot of the growth, began to collapse. They were dependent on China, which further undermined growth. And so Dilma barely squeaked out a re-election win in 2014. It was very tightly contested. And then 16 months later, she was impeached because by that point, her approval ratings were at 12%. Huge numbers of businesses had gone out of business. The unemployment rate, I think it was 15 million people unemployed. There was street violence that had returned at crisis levels. So the kind of convergence of multiple crises, it just seemed like the whole society was collapsing. And so people's anger obviously got directed at a lot of different places, but one of them was the party that governed since 2002, right? If you're angry at the ruling class, you're going to be angry at the party that has been in control of the country for 14 years. And so to say they were angry at neoliberalism is a bit of a crude formula for it, because it isn't, as you say, exactly correct that if you say to Lula and Dilma, what is your politics? They're not going to talk about, neoliberalism the way, say, Bill Clinton would, or Joe Manchin or Joe Biden. They're going to rhetorically talk about it in a more leftist way, but the reality of their governance was much different, in part because of the need to assuage the people who wield power, and in part because of this need to maintain coalition government. It did govern for the benefit of the rich. And so as the poor people started losing out first in what became these shrinking resources, the level of anger and dissatisfaction increased. And again, you ask people who in the United States, how can someone twice vote for Obama and then suddenly vote for Hitler?
Right.
Or why do, British working class people who were integrated into Europe vote for Brexit, despite all economists telling them it will be harmful to them? It's because their justifiable rage becomes so intense that they know that the ruling class has contempt for them, and they want to send a cruise missile back to the people they accurately perceive as ruining their lives.
See, this is fascinating. And I think we're trying to set the stage really for Bolsonaro when we get there, which is that there are all these interlocking parts. It's also interesting from a U.S. perspective. Lula was very independent of the U.S. on a foreign policy level. And then thinking about that, what I really want is more of since you have such a great perspective, both in terms of your criticisms, of the U.S., but like you also live in Brazil, in the context of like the Monroe Doctrine, U.S. foreign policy towards Brazil, maybe South and Central America in particular. What is your view of the legacy of that in our current policy manifestations? Because, co-host Crystal, like she's talking a lot about this, about the legacy of the Cold War and of U.S. meddling in Central America and how that might drive the border crisis. I think there's something there, but I also think there's a lot of discrete things that are happening down in Central America. Brazil very much seems the very same story. So I'm curious for your perspective, both on the legacy of U.S. involvement in Brazil, the country you know best, but also in the region, and maybe what's the lesson that we should learn, America should learn in this moment about how to engage going forward?
And one quick thing to add to this cascade of questions, Glenn, could you explain what the Monroe Doctrine was for those listeners who were not paying attention during AP U.S. history?
Yeah, the Monroe Doctrine is so fascinating. It has its name because it was issued under President James Monroe. It was framed as an anti-imperial document. It was intended to express these anti-imperialistic values, saying that we are done, the United States is, tolerating European interference in Central and South America. That's what it says explicitly. It's like kind of written as this defense of the sovereignty of these countries. Right. But it was clear from the very beginning that its actual purpose was to say, we're tired of and will no longer tolerate European dominance of this region because this is our backyard, and the only ones who have the right to dominate this region is us, the United States. And throughout the 19th century, that became ever more explicit. So there were a bunch of crises where the UK and the British Empire or France would try and interfere in the internal affairs of various countries with which they had this longstanding imperial or colonial relationship. And secretaries of state would write letters essentially saying, no, our law is fiat. And that just the Monroe Doctrine, even though it was evident from the start, just became more explicitly a declaration that Latin America is for the United States and it alone to rule, because that's our backyard. And so we're the only ones who have a sufficient level of interest to dictate what happens there. And that really became the mentality, obviously, throughout the 20th century as well. I mean, that was the mentality of the US during the Cold War for every region in the world, but particularly Central and South America. That was why we almost had a nuclear war with Russia over Cuba because of its proximity to the United States. So many of the worst coups sponsored by the CIA, like in Guatemala, in Chile, in Brazil, in Argentina, even through the 1980s with Reagan's dirty wars in El Salvador and Nicaragua, was all growing out of this mentality that the US has the right to rule these other countries. And, it is true that so many of the current problems we have right through today, including the immigration crisis, is a byproduct of the way we've completely fucked over those countries. As Sagar was saying earlier, you can't really say that the US is the only agent of destruction and chaos in these countries. I mean, people in those countries bear responsibility as well. But when you're, the most powerful country on earth and are explicitly and directly interfering using massive military might and covert operations and money and diplomacy and intelligence to remove the leaders that you dislike violently and install the ones that you like because they're going to serve your interests, and preferring the ones who are even more despotic than democratic, because the more despotic they are, the more they can keep the population under control, you're obviously going to wreak enormous amounts of havoc all throughout the region where you're doing that. And on top of that, you're going to sow a lot of anti-American sentiment. As I was saying before, the Iranians still hate the United States because they remember the Shah of Iran. And the Iranian revolution and the mullahs who now rule Iran so tyrannically are a byproduct of that anger to overthrow the Shah as well. They had a burgeoning democracy in Iran and like so many other countries as well. So you not only basically destabilize these regions and prevent them from developing into stable democracies, which then in turn causes economic instability, huge migration, crises at the border. You also generate an enormous amount of rage. If one of the reasons why, for example, the NSA reporting resonated so much in Brazil, there were a lot of stories about NSA spying. We reported that the NSA was spying on Dilma's personal cell phone. People
Right.
probably remember that we had a story about Angela Merkel's cell phone. There was also a very similar one about Dilma when she was president. They were spying on Petrobras, the most important state-owned oil company, on the Ministry of Mines and Energy, on the population as a whole. The reason that resonated so much and people were so angry by it was because it reeked of the same kind of colonialism that the United States has been practicing in Brazil and in the region for many decades, the same kind of colonialism or imperialism that brought them the military dictatorship. So when John Bolton, for example, wanted to engineer a classic coup in Venezuela, he explicitly cited the Monroe Doctrine as the reason to do it. And, with both Democrats and Republicans, the formal position of both the Democratic and Republican Party is that the legitimate president of Venezuela is Juan Guaido, somebody who has never received a single fucking vote for that office by Venezuelans. The United States just believes it has the right to declare who the president is. So the Monroe Doctrine has become this kind of blunt instrument that kind of the more traditional diplomats prefer not to talk about. Only the kind of John Boltons will be honest in saying the reason we get to go do this is because of the Monroe Doctrine. But absolutely, it was never revoked. And it's still very much, you look at every Latin American country, during Hillary Clinton's State Department, there was a soft coup in Venezuela that the United States very much had its fingerprints all over. What happened in Bolivia in 2019, I wouldn't say it was because of the US, but the US approved and supported it, and then kept that right-wing regime in place for over a year until there was finally elections that kicked them out of office. So it may not be as kind of overt as it was during the Cold War, but it's still very much an operation and causing a lot of the same damage.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a good place to take it to Bolsonaro in the context that most listeners will probably have heard his name. And this is in the category of I learned really useful frameworks from your book. Traditionally, when you hear about Bolsonaro in Western media, he's placed within the Trumpian leaders category. So there's, the Brexit, Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen of France, blah, 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 blah. Trump's part of that. And then Bolsonaro is included as well, too, because of the timing of all this. But you very specifically state that it isn't useful to consider Bolsonaro as a leader and both his faults and the reasons why he necessarily was successful within that same Trumpian complex. And you then compare him more to Duterte of the Philippines or Sisi from Egypt. Can you just explain this concept? Because I'd never heard it articulated that way before.
Yeah, the U.S. media is so stupid, and they,
you said it. We knew it was going to happen once.
Yeah. It'll probably happen again. I'm surprised it took this long. It's like what they were trying to convey was that Bolsonaro was this uniquely evil figure, and they don't know anything about Brazil. So all they could do is describe Bolsonaro through the prism of their own provincial perspective. And the worst insult that they thought they could apply to somebody was to call them Trump. So this cute little term, Trump of the tropics, is how the Western press started describing Bolsonaro. And not only was it inaccurate, wildly, fundamentally so, for reasons I'll explain in a second, you touched on some of them, but it was incredibly helpful to Bolsonaro, because if you look at it from the perspective of Brazilians, who have always been told that they're this third world country, they're this developing nation, and the United States is the most powerful and the richest country in the history of the world. And the Brazilian press was trying to isolate Bolsonaro as this radical fringe figure, but the Western press was saying, no, he's actually exactly like the president of the United States, the person who occupies the most powerful office in the world. It ended up normalizing, and not even normalizing, but almost elevating Bolsonaro in the minds of Brazilians, because they figured, well, that seems good, right? We've always had Brazilian presidents, and we get now to have someone exactly like the person who got elected to the most important, powerful, and richest country in the world. That seems like a good thing. That's a rational way of reacting. Mm-hmm. But the much worse part about it, other than the fact that it helped Bolsonaro, is that it was so inaccurate. I think one of the things I always notice is lots of people on the right have a very difficult time understanding the divisions and schisms on the left. There are a lot of people on the right who just think that like Chuck Schumer equals Nancy Pelosi equals AOC equals Bernie equals, these like blue dog Democrats, and that they're just all leftists. Like that's how Rush Limbaugh would talk about them, like Chuck Schumer being a leftist. But if you go to talk to a leftist and you call Chuck Schumer a leftist, they're going to vomit in your face, right? So it's very similar to how the left looks at the right.
Yeah.
Like they don't see that there's any difference between Josh Hawley and Mike Lee and Mitch McConnell and like corporatist Republicans, or they're just completely unaware of any of those distinctions. Right, exactly. Yeah, Glenn Beck, it's just they're completely, or Sagar, they don't comprehend that these schisms and debates exist on the right, and they do, probably more so these days than on the left. So they see Bolsonaro, they see that he's a right-wing figure, they assume, because that's how their brains work, the people in the liberal media, the liberal sector of the media, that he must be like Trump. There is this new right, and the reason they're called the new right is because they're different than the old right. It's a modernized, updated version of right-wing politics. For one thing, it's more populist. Like when Marine Le Pen ran for president the last time against Macron, she not only ran to the left of Macron on social programs and retirement benefits and pension benefits and protecting workers' rights, she even ran to the left of the Socialist Party on those issues. The idea is close the borders, don't let any foreigners into our country, and then treat French workers better by giving them more benefits and giving them a better standard of living. Exactly what Steve Bannon's vision was of what the Trump presidency ought to be and what he had Trump pitch in 2016. Marine Le Pen never talks about LGBTs, except to the extent that she actually is supportive, because she sees it as a wedge that she can drive between liberal society and Muslims. Meaning, Muslim migrants come here, they hate gay rights, they want to take away feminism, they want to take away LGBT equality. Nigel Farage doesn't give a shit about gay rights. He barely ever, neither does Donald Trump. Right? Like you can find, Trump did a couple of
pro-gay marriage.
First, he's literally pro-gay marriage.
He's a fucking billionaire, who is a hedonist who's lived in Manhattan his whole life. He's been around nothing but gay men all his life. He did a couple of gestures, like he banned trans people from the military, which is gross. But by and large, it was not a focus at all of his, nor is communism really a focus of any of them. Donald Trump doesn't talk about communism, neither does Marine Le Pen, neither does Nigel Farage. So Bolsonaro is very much this throwback. There's a religious fervor that is central to his politics, this kind of fusion between Catholicism, which he technically still is, but evangelicalism, which he in fact is. His wife is evangelical. He has very much these kind of evangelical politics. The first thing he did upon getting elected, literally the next day, was he flew to Israel, and that kind of evangelical worship of Israel. He is obsessed with communists. He thinks that communists are the existential threat to Brazil. He is, his primary view for the last 30 years has been that the military dictatorship that ran the country until 1985 was the superior form of government to Brazilian democracy. He has repeatedly vowed that if he ever got elected president, the first thing he would do is close the Congress and then close the Supreme Court. They've constantly threatened to usher in this, repressive dictatorship set of decrees to give them the right to remove members of Congress, to remove judges, to punish people, to eliminate freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So it's a completely different approach. It's like this throwback to the kind of, Indonesian or Guatemalan or Chilean dictators the United States used to support in the name of stopping terrorism. His hero is Pinochet. That's where he came of age, is during the Cold War as part of the military. There's almost no new right politics to him at all. Even the populism, his economics minister is the reason why a lot of bourgeois people in good conscience voted for him. His name is Paulo Guedes. He was touted. He went to the University of Chicago. He's an austerity advocate. He wanted to turn Brazil into Chile, privatize all industry. And so you heard these rich, educated people all the time saying, I'm not voting for Bolsonaro, I'm voting for Paulo Guedes. So not even any kind of real populism, economic populism to anything that he does. It's very much just kind of hardened social conservatism, religious fanaticism, and most of all, violent authoritarianism in a way that just wasn't part of Trump's branding, campaign rhetoric, or governance.
So
see this
quick thing, just which is, you really talk about how, considering Lula has the opportunity to re-enter politics, we could see in 2022, like Lula versus Bolsonaro. And I don't want to be a dumb media person and analogize this too much to Trump versus Biden in 2020, but we're just going to roll with it for a second. And you can get your second reference in. But Trump doesn't govern under the Bannonite vision that you articulated really well there. But until the coronavirus, it's largely fine because the economy is doing better, tight labor markets, all that sort of business. So he had an opportunity to still win re-election before that. How does all of this play out, do you think, so far in Bolsonaro's context, in the sense that he's running against this 2016 status quo? There's all this anger. Yet, to your point, it's not really populist. It's much more focused on the culture issues. How do you think that is playing out in Brazilian politics today?
Yeah, it's interesting with Trump, right? Because Bannon's plan was get into office, do this massive infrastructure deal with Pelosi and Schumer that Biden's now doing, raise taxes on the rich, and then build your wall. And Trump had, those instincts. I mean, the weirdest thing I think I've ever seen was after Trump lost, after the election, he said, $600 checks are not good enough. I'm vetoing this shit until you give people to. Imagine if that Trump had been anywhere like during the coronavirus. Just give money for free to people. That's ultimately what people want. Yeah. A lot of people are surprised Bolsonaro's approval ratings have been as high as they are, given all these scandals that his family is enmeshed in. He really has handled the coronavirus worse than any world leader by far. Brazil is now the epicenter of
how is that?
The COVID
how specifically?
Crisis.
How did he handle it poorly? Specifically,
I mean, he did a lot of what Boris Johnson and Donald Trump did at the beginning, which was downplaying the seriousness of the virus, calling it a little flu, saying that there's no reason to close businesses over it. He'd be asked about the death toll, and he would say everybody dies. But then, unlike Trump and Boris Johnson, you started realizing, no, actually, we can't function. The healthcare system is going to collapse. Bolsonaro never abandoned that. In fact, he got more aggressive about it. He got the coronavirus. He claims that he was cured by some of those magical cures that he had been pushing, that Trump had been pushing as well. But mostly, he's just been doing everything possible to encourage people to ignore the coronavirus. For a long time, he was saying he didn't think the vaccine was worth the billions of dollars that it would take to buy them. So I think only 2 to 3% of the Brazilian population is now vaccinated, as compared to, I think it's like 15, 20, 25% in the United States. And that in turn, also just the rapid spread through favelas and everywhere else was a breeding ground for this variant that is obviously way more contagious. And I'm close to being certain is also more lethal. Mm-hmm. So I think in March, the statistic is of all Brazilian deaths from COVID, 25% happened in March of 2021 alone.
Wow.
There are now, it's between 1 in 3 and 1 out of 4 of every person on the planet who dies of COVID is in Brazil, even though Brazil is only 3% of the world's population. So it's by every metric, the worst possible country in terms of how it's been managed. It's likely to be, he went through 4 different health ministers because every time he tried to find one crazier than the next, they weren't crazy enough. They were like, I'm not going before, the public and in a press conference, I'm endorsing your idea that everybody should just throw away their masks and burn them and go back to work. I'm not going to say that. So we kept firing them. So it was just like a complete disaster. But for a while, his popularity had been maintained because the Congress, over his objections, voted to give monthly payments to people, because otherwise the whole social fabric would have unraveled. If you tell people you can't, poor people, you can't go to work, you can't leave your house, but we're also not going to give you money for food. So they were getting monthly checks. And even though he opposed it, he's very politically clever. He then took the credit for it. His popularity was increasing, but now those checks have stopped. People realize, there's the military is abandoning him. The kind of entrepreneurial classes abandoning him. Brazil is becoming increasingly isolated. No one wants to do business with Brazil. The borders are closed to every Brazilian. Foreign capital has fled. Big factories have closed. They, even a lot of the sectors that had been supportive of him, thinking they could get stuff from him, have now completely turned against him. And he's kind of stuck with this nub of like 25 to 30% of the extremist base that he has. The problem is, it's kind of like if you're Donald Trump in 2016, your dream candidate is Hillary Clinton because she's one of the only people as polarizing as you are. And, you saw the difference between what happened when Trump ran against a hated, polarizing figure like Hillary Clinton versus when he ran against a candidate that's hard to hate like Joe Biden. Lula, because of everything that has happened with Dilma and the collapse of the government and the economy and the corruption scandal, he went to prison unjustly, but he did, is so polarizing that I think it's Bolsonaro's only hope to get reelected, at least in his mind.
Wow.
That he run against Lula as opposed to any other figure. And the problem is Lula is still sufficiently popular that it's very hard to see that if they both run, there's a runoff system. So you have a bunch of people running in the first round. If no one gets more than 50%, the two top candidates go to the next round and run against each other. That's what happened in 2018. Lula was barred from running because of this unjust conviction that has now been reversed. His handpicked selector, his handpicked successor, the former mayor of São Paulo, ran against Bolsonaro. So Bolsonaro got to run against PT, and he won easily by 12 points. That's what Bolsonaro is hoping to be able to do again. Lula is a figure of the past. He's going to bring in communism, corruption, remember all the suffering, the misery that you had. But Lula is at least as talented and probably much more talented of a political demagogue than Bolsonaro. He just gave this kind of comeback interview, and you were just mesmerized by there's just nobody that communicates like Lula. So he's very ready, and it's hard for me to see Bolsonaro beating him, although it's far away and a lot can happen.
I'm so fascinated by that. Cool. And in one way, he is like Trump, and he's completely incompetent, it turns out, whenever it comes to COVID. And from that perspective, I guess that's what I was wondering, which is that my view of politics really, really was changed by the results of 2020, because I just saw how epically powerful the culture war can be, how so many people are not just willing to forgive, outright look past, and actually add votes simply because they hate dominant cultural liberalism. That can bring you 45,000 votes away from the presidency. I'm curious, given all of this, all the failures, all of what Bolsonaro, screwed up COVID, even though he's losing elite support and more, as you discussed, people were still fed up back whenever Bolsonaro was elected with crime, whatever. Is that dominant force still there in Brazil? In that Christian right, almost Christian fascism, not to play into too much of a trope, but I think it's semi-accurate in this particular case. Does that still have power and resonance in Brazil in the same way? Or am I just trying to interpose U.S. politics onto Brazil?
No, I mean, one of the reasons why I would never count Bolsonaro out is in part because of what happened in 2020. If you're an incumbent, how could you have a worse set of circumstances than Trump had? A once in a century pandemic that put tens of millions of people out of work, that pretty clearly, maybe you haven't mismanaged as badly as Bolsonaro, but people remember you were talking about drinking bleach and shoving lamps up your ass and, just the craziest stuff. People remember that. The economy is in shambles. People are dying. It just feels like a very sickly country on all levels. Polls were showing him being devastated and destroyed he had nothing but scandals, and yet he almost won. He came very close to winning.
Yeah.
You couldn't have asked for a better, more favorable playing field for the Democrats, and they still almost lost. And I think it's because elite liberal institutions, the media, the establishment wings of both parties, kind of corporate America, the respectable, clean, educated, powerful parts of society, Hollywood, the culture, they haven't come to terms with how much they're hated. And whatever they oppose, people are going to support.
Yes.
And I think that's very much the same in Brazil, without question. And Bolsonaro is hated by every sector of elite culture now, every sector of elite culture. But they're a minority and people despise them. And so that is absolutely going to be Bolsonaro's, strongest point. And it's not just his. That's why I try and make the point.
Yeah.
That if you look at Brazilian politics, there's so many lessons to draw that are applicable completely, notwithstanding how different the country is, to American democracy, to Western European democracy, to British democracy, in terms of the sentiments that are driving these surprising outcomes and the utter inability of people who do politics and media for a living to understand or predict or even make sense of not just the undercurrents before it all happens, but even the result afterward.
Yes.
So my last question here, which comes directly from what you're saying here, which is, if we're talking about the dynamic that Trump was able to almost use to get reelected, it's especially in those vulnerable swing states, even in communities that you didn't think would vote Republican, it's the combination of defund the police style culture things, and then also, especially in places like Florida, radical socialism, that sort of specific 1-2 argument. I'm curious, in the Brazilian context, how does the center left handle the cultural issues that Bolsonaro is bringing to the table? So how does the center left think about crime? How does the center left think about the LGBTQ issues that he's so putting at the center of his policy? Because I don't think it's going to be the same dynamic as happens in the US, at least. I don't think there's defund the police in the favelas is really what I'm getting at.
Right. I think it was really interesting when Marielle Franco, the friend of ours I was describing earlier, was assassinated. The Bolsonaristas tried to depict her as this anti-police monster because she had spent a lot of time, like a lot of leftist politicians do, denouncing police brutality. But then, as it turned out, all these mothers of slain police officers came forward and said, when my son was killed, the only person in government I could find to help us was her. She would take a bus 2 hours across town and sit down with us and work with us on death benefits, how we could raise funds, because she came from these neighborhoods and she didn't see the police as bad. She saw individual officers as bad, but not the police force itself. I was on this panel. You guys probably remember that day when I was on live TV and I got physically assaulted by that that old Bolsonaro
guy on YouTube.
Right. Yeah. The night before, I was on this panel at this university in Sao Paulo, and it was a leftist event, a leftist media event, and I was on the panel with this Black woman who was a professor at the school, and she came from the favela, and she still lives in the favela, and she told this story. She said she has a brother, he's 22, and he just got a job, his first job, 7 months earlier. And it requires him to wake up at 5:30 in the morning, catch a bus for an hour, go to the train, another hour to downtown Sao Paulo, where he then works, doesn't make a lot of money, but he was able to save up enough to buy his first cell phone, buy sneakers. And she said twice in the last 7 months, while he was waiting for the bus in the middle of the night, or pre-dawn when it was still dark, he got mugged at gunpoint, had his cell phone and his sneakers stolen. And she said, what does the left have to say to him? Nothing. The left is talking about trans rights and, feminism and the Black movement in this very abstract way. What does it have to say about these people who are struggling with their daily lives just to have the basic needs met of physical security, financial needs to be able to, she's nothing. And until the left figures out how to communicate with people about their lives, the things they care about, they're always going to lose to someone who says, oh, I have the solution. I'm going to go kill all the criminals. Mm-hmm. And obviously that is the challenge for the left that they have not yet reconciled, which is how do you satisfy what you need, which is this youth movement of millennials and Gen Z, the kind of energy that drives your movement, who are obsessed with cultural issues. And you have to talk about them and take these radical positions. But then to win elections, you also need like religious people and like socially conservative people. And if you talk about abortion and if you talk about, putting trans women in bathrooms, you're going to lose them, even though with every other issue, right? Like economic inequality and welfare benefits and schooling and they're all on your side. And there's this really smart center left politician who I really love, Ciro Gomez. I've interviewed him a couple of times. He came in third in the 2018 election. He's been governor and senator. And he's talking about how the Brazilian left has become contaminated by the American left and its obsession with identity politics. And there's this like great video I posted with the subtitles where he's like, for 4 years before the election, rich women get pregnant and no problem, they pay to go to private clinics and they get abortions. Poor women get pregnant and they like go to these back alley places with hangers and they like arrive at the hospital like barely alive, and no one talks about this. And then like 2 months before the election, the left comes to you and says, you need to say you're in favor of full abortion in like a country that is the biggest Catholic population on the planet with this huge evangelical. And so he's like, and then like you lose these huge numbers of people that you need to win the election. And it's all because of the American left has taught them this bullshit, this stupidity. And I don't know the answer to this question. And I don't think anyone knows the answer to this question. You look at Bernie in 2016, who did way better than in 2020, because in 2016, he just did his standard class issues.
Yeah.
And he attracted all these rural voters and like nonpartisan voters and conservative voters. And then in 2020, it became he just sounded like a normal Democrat, and like used race and, Trump is a racist and Trump's a white nationalist, just the standard Democratic rhetoric. And all those rural voters went to like Pete Buttigieg and he couldn't compete with Joe Biden. So how to fuse those two things is the thing that the left hasn't figured out, which is why the left can't win anywhere.
Right. The true question really for the left. I guess my final question here, Glenn, which is that, and you said something, you drew this parallel, which is what lessons do we have for, if you're American, you're listening to this podcast. I think people should care about Brazil regardless, but if you're an American, you're listening to this podcast, we look at Brazil, as you said, it's got this great promise, such a beautiful country. It's often cited as an example of like, we've got all this gated up potential and it just needs to be released. I think we hear that here too. What lessons can Americans, right and left, draw from your book, The Story of Brazil, and what can they use it in their daily lives and in their political information to try to live in a better country?
Well, so, if I had to like define my book, when I like wrote the Snowden book, obviously there was a lot in there about surveillance and privacy, because that's what the reporting was about. But I always thought about that book more as about a book about journalism and democracy. Like I always felt like that was more like the work we did with Snowden was more about how a media and journalists should behave and how it can benefit a democracy and how abuse of power destroys a democracy. And that's very much what I look at this book as. Like, of course, I need to tell the story of Brazil for people to understand the context of that story. And I do think it's fascinating unto itself and also important geostrategically. Brazil has tons of oil, it has the Amazon, all that. But most of it is like my telling the story of like what happened with how I did this journalism, the pressures, the attacks by the government. And we debate so much like why the US media is so shitty in the US, and it is. But like the reason why that matters so much is because you really do need a free press in a democracy that's healthy and functioning the right way in order to have like an informed citizenry, which in turn lets that citizenry make smart decisions about how it wants to interact with the society. And in order to do that, you have to have journalists who are devoted to confronting power centers and challenging power, and have that kind of journalism be supported and let it be free of ideological constraints or the captivity to particular dogma. You need it to just be unleashed in order to go after the people who wield the most power. The problem with Brazil has always been that the people who wield the greatest power never have any meaningful accountability or meaningful challenges, and therefore can propagandize the public, can control and manipulate the public. And the only real tonic to that, in my view, is journalism, is shining a light on what they're actually doing. And that's what the book is about, is our attempt to do that. And I think in the US, it's the same thing. A big part of why I think American politics has gone so off track is because our dominant media has completely lost sight of what healthy core journalistic values are. And it's a reason why I think the media needs so much more attention, and why these debates around journalism are about a lot more than just a bunch of like reporters, bickering with one another. It's about how the society functions and what ways we can find out of all of the multiple crises that are plaguing the governance of the country and the society itself.
Yeah, really well said. Glenn, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Your book, Secure Democracy, is going to be available on our bookshelf. We'll put the link in the show notes, promotion, all of that. Appreciate you joining us, sir. Thank you.
Hey, great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me. I very appreciate it.